we are going to be wrestling with the failure of companies that, by all traditional standards, did everything right.
That's really the critical starting point, isn't it? We're not analyzing companies that were, lazy or poorly managed or slow to innovate.
Not at all.
We're talking about Titans market leaders like Sears in retail, Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC in computing, or Xerox in copying technology.
Yeah, companies that were constantly praised right up until the end for their financial discipline and for listening so closely to their customers.
And yet they all ultimately failed to maintain market dominance. It's a fascinating and frankly a terrifying pattern.
Their failure wasn't about incompetence. It was, as our source material argues, often a direct consequence of applying the very best management practices, but just in the face of the wrong kind of change.
Right. I mean, they listened to the customers who paid the bills. They allocated their resources with ruthless efficiency. They invested in technologies that promised the highest, most predictable returns.
And those perfectly rational, MBA-approved decisions effectively signed their death warrant.
The sources, and here we're really leaning on the foundational work of Clayton M. Christensen in The Innovator's Dilemma, they provide the framework for understanding this structural flaw.
So our mission today is to cut through all that complexity and give you a deep, thorough understanding of disruptive innovation.
We want you to see how it works, why it sneaks up on these great companies, and what forces are, truly at play under the surface.
And we're going to use two very different histories to illustrate this. First, the fast history of the hard disk drive industry, where market cycles run in just a few years.
A perfect little laboratory.
And then the slow history of the mechanical executor industry, which took decades to unfold.
And you'll see it's amazing the pattern holds. It doesn't matter if the pace of change is frantic or glacial. The physics are the same.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we have to start by redefining how we think about technology.
Right. To truly grasp the dilemma, we need to abandon the traditional and frankly simple way of classifying technological change.
What do you mean by that?
Well, most people talk about incremental innovation, a small tweak versus radical innovation, which is some massive, complex breakthrough. Christensen's work shows that this distinction is, from a strategic point of view, basically useless for predicting failure.
That's a big claim. Why is that distinction insufficient? I mean, we often associate failure with a company's inability to handle some truly radical, complex new technology.
Because the sources introduce a far more crucial distinction: sustaining technologies versus disruptive technologies.
Okay.
A sustaining technology, by its very definition, improves the performance of established products along the dimensions that your mainstream customers already value.
So things like bigger capacity, faster speed, better reliability.
Higher efficiency. All the things your best customers are already asking you for and paying you for.
So if I'm a high-end customer, I'm going to look at that new sustaining technology and immediately see its value relative to what I'm already buying.
Exactly. And here is the core, and it's an almost overlooked insight from the research. Sustaining innovations can be incredibly radical. They can be complex, discontinuous, you name it.
Give me an example.
Okay. In the disk drive industry, developing thin film heads was a massive technological undertaking. I mean, it cost something like $100 million and took 8 years of R&D. That's radical by any measure.
Sure, absolutely.
But because that massive effort resulted in a drive that was faster and held more data, the dimensions customers already valued, it was, by definition, a sustaining innovation.
So it was hard, but it fit perfectly into their existing business model.
Precisely. And in every single case studied in the sources, the established leading firms consistently dominated the development and adoption of these sustaining technologies. It didn't matter how radical or difficult they were.
So the failure of great companies is not a result of being technologically behind on sustaining innovation.
It never is. They are masters of that game.
Okay, so if sustaining innovation just reinforces the status quo, the disruptive twin must be the one that shatters it. How does that actually manifest?
Disruptive technologies, and this is the key, they initially deliver worse product performance, at least as measured by the mainstream market.
Worse.
Yes, worse. It's critical to understand that initial inferiority. If you are serving the high-end market and some new technology emerges that offers, say, only 1/10 the performance, it is rationally and correctly rejected by your best customers.
But if the new product is worse, how does it ever disrupt anything?
Because it offers a very different value proposition. Disruptive products are typically cheaper, simpler, smaller, and significantly more convenient or, rugged to use.
Ah, so they're playing a different game. They're competing on different attributes.
Exactly. They appeal to a market that either doesn't exist yet or to customers who were previously non-consumers, people who couldn't afford or couldn't use the existing complicated product.
And these new users, they prize the new attributes, the simplicity, the small size way more than the high performance of the mainstream product.
And the paradox, the absolute core of the dilemma, lies in the fact that these simpler, technologically inferior products are the ones that consistently cause the downfall of the incumbents.
Not the complex, radical, sustaining breakthroughs that everyone's worried about.
It's the ultimate counterintuitive lesson. Managers invest heavily in the difficult, high-margin, sustaining breakthroughs that their customers want, only to be killed by the simple, low-margin, small-market product they dismissed as a toy.
This madness.
Well, it only makes sense if you look at the fundamental relationship between technological progress and market demand. And the sources frame this beautifully using the concept of the performance trajectory.
Right, like this trajectory concept is the core driver here because it explains why the market even opens up for disruption in the first place. Let's look at this idea of the overshoot.
Okay. Imagine two lines on a graph plotting performance over time. The lower line represents the performance that customers are actually demanding and can realistically utilize. That line, it tends to move up at a pretty steady, predictable rate. It's often related to their own business cycles or, their processing requirements.
Got it. A slow and steady climb. Now, the second line is the rate of technological progress.
Right. That's the performance that suppliers, driven by competitive pressures and their R&D capability, are able to provide.
And that second line moves upward much, much faster.
Way faster. Competition forces firms to constantly seek these incremental and radical breakthroughs. It's how they secure higher margins and better market positions.
So the net result is that suppliers inevitably overshoot the market.
They deliver customers more performance than they actually need or are even willing to pay for.
This feels incredibly relevant today. I mean, you think about modern desktop computers or even the cameras on high-end smartphones. We are constantly getting hardware upgrades that most users, myself included, will never fully utilize.
That is a perfect real-world analogy of the overshoot mechanism in action. If you buy a professional-grade camera, the vast majority of consumers don't need or even know how to use the full range of its functionality.
And this creates a psychological gap and a financial one.
And what does that gap create at the bottom of the market?
An opportunity.
It creates an enormous vacuum where simplicity and low cost become the dominant competitive factors. Because that technology curve is so steep, a disruptive product that looks weak and unappealing today.
Like a cloud-based application with less functionality than the big legacy software.
Exactly. It will inevitably, just due to the sheer pace of improvement, become fully competitive with the mainstream market tomorrow, or maybe the day after.
And when that cheap, simple product eventually reaches the minimal performance threshold that the mainstream requires.
The mainstream customers will jump ship instantly because they've been overshot for years. They're finally getting what they need for a fraction of the cost, and they can get rid of all the incumbents' complexity and high-margin architecture.
It's that intersection point. That's where the disruption becomes lethal.
That's the moment of truth.
So to bring this theory to life, let's look at the hard disk drive industry. Christensen famously called it the fruit fly industry. It's just an ideal laboratory, isn't it? The cycles of innovation, emergence, maturity, and decline happen so quickly.
The pace of change was just astonishing. The sources highlight that areal density, that's megabits per square inch, it increased by an astounding 35% per year.
Every single year.
Every year for decades. And at the same time, the physical size was shrinking at a similarly brutal rate. I mean, a 20 megabyte drive, which took up 800 cubic inches in 1978, had shrunk to just 1.4 cubic inches by 1993.
That's an incredible rate of change.
That level of miniaturization and density increase is a relentless, continuous upward sprint.
And that pace, it must have led to massive market instability and an extremely high mortality rate. Can you quantify that for us?
I can. Of the 17 established firms operating in 1976, and these were the pioneers, the companies that created mainframe storage, all but one, IBM, had failed or were acquired by 1995.
Wow.
And on top of that, 129 additional firms entered the fray during that time, and 109 of those failed too.
And so this wasn't some stable, slow-moving market. It was a complete bloodbath.
It was a highly competitive, technologically intense environment, but, and this is the crucial point, those established, failing firms were actually brilliant innovators in one very specific area.
Sustaining technology.
Absolutely. The research clearly shows that when it came to developing the difficult, complex component technologies, the incumbents led the way. They mastered radical sustaining innovations, things like the move to thin film heads and disks, or complex RLL recording codes.
These were massive projects, multi-million-dollar, multi-year R&D efforts.
They were constantly scrambling up what the book calls the technology mudslide, and this completely refutes the common assumption that these companies failed because they couldn't keep up with the pace of change.
No, they were technological pioneers, at least in their own value network.
The technology mudslide hypothesis, this idea that the rate of change just overwhelmed them, was fundamentally wrong. Their failure lay not in their ability to innovate, but in their organizational willingness to adopt a specific type of innovation.
The disruptive architectural changes that shrank the drive size.
That was the fatal flaw.
Okay, let's focus on those size reductions, these architectural changes. From the 14-inch down to the 8-inch, then 8-inch to 5.25-inch, and so on. These were the disruptive events. So let's start with the first major disruption, the 8-inch drive.
So the 14-inch drive was the incumbent standard. It was sold to the high-end mainframe market. When entrants like Shugart and Micropolis introduced the 8-inch drive, it had a maximum capacity of only 10 to 40 megabytes.
Which was nothing to a mainframe customer.
It was useless. Mainframe customers needed hundreds of megabytes, and they valued cost per megabyte above everything else. They rationally looked at this new 8-inch drive and said, it's useless. It costs more per megabyte, and it doesn't fit our needs at all.
So the incumbent 14-inch makers, by doing their job, by listening to their largest, most profitable mainframe customers, they received explicit feedback to ignore this new architecture.
And this is the managerial dilemma beginning to crystallize, isn't it? The 8-inch drive, though it was inferior in capacity, offered a totally new value proposition, smaller size.
Which made it suitable for a new market.
The emerging mini-computer market. Firms like Wang and DEC. Suddenly, mini-computers could be desk-side, running in a normal office environment rather than needing a dedicated raised-floor computer room.
So the mini-computer customers prized that small size and convenience, even if it meant a higher cost per megabyte.
A completely different set of priorities. And the 14-inch drive makers were essentially held captive by their own customers, who pulled them along a continuing trajectory of capacity growth in the wrong, dying platform.
And they couldn't justify investing in the 8-inch market, right? Because their existing financial structure, which was geared toward those juicy 50–60% mainframe margins, just couldn't handle the lower margins of the mini-computer market.
It made no financial sense to them. And this pattern, it repeated flawlessly with the next transition. The 8-inch drive makers became the new incumbents. When the 5.25-inch drive was introduced by an entrant firm, Seagate Technology, its initial capacity was only 5 to 10 megabytes.
Let me guess. The established 8-inch mini-computer customers needed 40 to 60 megabytes.
You got it. So once again, the mainstream customers rationally rejected the new, smaller architecture. This forced the new entrant, Seagate, to go out and find a completely new value network.
And they found the brand new desktop personal computer market.
They did. To a PC user back then, 5 to 10 megabytes was a massive amount of storage, and the small size was essential for fitting into the limited space of a desktop tower.
So the 8-inch drive makers they watched their market share evaporate.
Right.
Because they were waiting for the 5.25-inch drives to be good enough for their existing mini-computer customers.
By the time that happened, it was far too late. The game was over.
Okay, let's drill down into that famous anecdote of Seagate itself failing to adopt the 3.5-inch drive. I mean, this is the perfect illustration of why good management leads to failure.
This is a textbook case. It's organizational rationality trumping long-term strategic vision. So around 1985, Seagate engineers, who are extremely talented, remember, they developed working prototypes of the 3.5-inch architecture well ahead of the market. They were technologically ready.
But they had to use what the sources refer to as bootlegged resources. So why the secrecy? Why did they have to hide their work from management?
Because the formal resource allocation process of a successful large company is ruthlessly efficient. Any new project has to compete for capital and for talent against existing projects that are already profitable and have established customer demand.
So if the engineers went through the formal process and admitted, hey, this 3.5-inch drive is initially inferior, it's low margin, and it targets a tiny unproven market, what happens?
The project will be killed instantly by any rational finance committee. It wouldn't stand a chance. So they had to circumvent the very systems that made Seagate so excellent at selling 5.25-inch drives.
And then the marketing division made the killer move.
The marketers took the 3.5-inch prototypes and they did their job. They showed them to their lead desktop PC customers, like IBM's PC division.
And the customers, who were totally embedded in that 5.25-inch value network, demanded higher capacity.
They wanted 40 to 60 megabytes, which the little 3.5-inch drive couldn't offer yet. I think it maxed out at around 20 megabytes. So the feedback was lukewarm to negative.
And based on this rational, customer-driven feedback, marketing generated a pessimistic sales forecast for the new 3.5-inch architecture. Something like, what, maybe $50 million in volume?
Great. Now, you're a manager at Seagate. You compare that $50 million forecast for an unproven low-margin technology to the company's existing high-margin 5.25-inch models, which are promising $500 million in established volume with healthy margins.
A no-brainer.
Any rational manager running a public company focused on quarterly growth and maximizing shareholder value would kill the disruptive project and pour all their resources into the known high-return opportunity.
And that's exactly what Seagate did. The project was shelved.
The ultimate managerial justification? It didn't make financial sense for our existing business.
And immediately, the vacuum was filled by an entrant.
Connor Peripherals, which was founded by ex-Seagate engineers, took that 3.5-inch design and sold it to the emerging portable and laptop market, companies like Compaq and Toshiba.
A completely different value network.
In the portable computing value network, cost per megabyte was completely irrelevant. What mattered was size, weight, ruggedness, and low power consumption.
So for those laptop customers, the 3.5-inch drive was actually a sustaining innovation. It was better along the dimensions they valued.
Precisely. Connor thrived by finding that new niche application. When Seagate belatedly tried to jump back into the 3.5-inch market years later, they found they could only successfully sell the drives to their existing desktop customers.
So they were just cannibalizing their old 5.25-inch sales.
That's right. They never successfully captured the new laptop market that Connor and others had pioneered because they lacked the cost structure and the internal processes that had been honed in that low-power, ruggedness-focused value network.
It was too late. The ship had sailed.
The failure was complete.
The disk drive history makes it so clear that the technology itself wasn't the problem. It was the mechanism of organizational inertia. And that mechanism is best encapsulated by this concept of the value network. Spend some time really defining this.
Right. The value network is the ecosystem in which a firm operates. It's the nexus of your customers, your suppliers, your competitors, and your firm's specific cost structure. The network defines the rules of the game.
So it dictates what metrics are important and what level of profitability is considered acceptable.
Exactly. And the sources break down the value network's influence into two crucial boundaries. First is the specific rank-ordered importance of product attributes.
Right. The priority list.
Correct. For the mainframe network, the order was capacity, then speed, then reliability, and finally cost per megabyte. For the portable computing network, the order was totally different. Ruggedness, low power consumption, small size, and then cost per megabyte was way down the list.
So when you present the same physical product, that 3.5-inch drive, to these two different networks, you get two completely rational yet opposite reactions.
The mainframe customer says, this is trash. The portable customer says, this is essential. We have to have it.
And the second boundary is the financial reality. It's the cost structures and the margins that are required to operate profitably within that specific network. This is where an incumbent's profitability becomes their prison.
Absolutely. Think about the resources you need to serve a high-end mainframe customer. You need a huge R&D budget to deliver those complex, sustaining innovations. You need a direct sales force to negotiate massive contracts, a large service infrastructure.
All of that costs a lot of money.
It does, and that requires margins of 50 to 60%, like we saw with the 14-inch drive makers.
But then a new market emerges, like the desktop PC market, where sales are conducted through distributors, service contracts are smaller, the technology is simpler.
And the required margins just plummet, down to maybe 25 or 30%.
And this is the fatal tether. A manager at a company that's accustomed to 40% margins cannot, in good faith, allocate scarce resources away from a 40% opportunity to a 15% opportunity.
Even if that 15% opportunity is the future.
Why not?
Because the company's capital structure, its overhead, its growth expectations for Wall Street, they are all predicated on maintaining those high margins. The organization is simply not built to make money in the low-end, low-margin value network.
This realization that the established firm's failures are rooted in three perfectly rational financial bases, all tied to their existing profitable value network, that's the true core of the dilemma.
Yeah, the three financial killers are: one, disruptive products are simpler, they're cheaper, and they promise drastically lower margins and profits than your established business.
So your spreadsheets tell you to run away.
Two, they are first commercialized in insignificant emerging markets. A successful, say, $4 billion company requires hundreds of millions in new sales just to satisfy Wall Street's growth expectations. No emerging market is ever that large initially.
It's a rounding error on their P&L.
And three, leading firms' most profitable, best-paying customers do not want or cannot use the disruptive technology, which just reinforces the decision to kill the project.
It's a vicious cycle where managerial excellence becomes strategically short-sighted. So let's take that six-step failure pattern that the sources track and overlay it onto the disk drive history just to tune the abstract pattern into a concrete narrative.
Okay, we start with step one, development within established firms. The engineers are capable and clever. They develop the 3.5-inch drive prototypes, but they have to use those bootlegged resources because the organization's formal processes would otherwise kill the project.
Step two. Lead customers react. Marketing does its job, shows the lower-performing disruptive tech to the best customers, IBM in the desktop space, who rationally reject the low-capacity drive. And this creates the negative sales forecasts.
Step three, the pace of sustaining tech accelerates. With the disruptive project now discredited by customer feedback, all the resources flood back into the sustaining projects.
Like accelerating the RLL codes or thin film heads on the existing 5.25-inch platform.
Right, the stuff that's easier to justify based on established customer needs and promises higher returns.
This is the internal hardening phase, right? The incumbent is busy fighting its peers and competitors in the high-end market, and they're completely blind to the threat that's emerging below them.
Exactly. Which leads to step four. New companies emerge. Frustrated, disaffected, or just unaffiliated engineers form entrants, like Connor Peripherals, and crucially, they seek out new value networks, the laptop market by trial and error. They succeed because their small size and low-cost structure perfectly align with the low-margin needs of that emerging market.
And then step five. The entrants move upmarket. This is the invasion. Because the rate of technological improvement, that 35% density increase every year, is so much faster than the rate of market demand increase.
The little 3.5-inch drives quickly gained capacity. Once they could offer 40 megabytes, they became financially and physically superior to the old 5.25-inch drives, and they began their devastating march into the mainstream desktop market.
Which brings us to the final step.
And finally, step six. Established firms belatedly jump. Seagate eventually rushes to introduce competitive 3.5-inch drives, but the move is merely defensive. They're forced to fight with a cost structure that was built for high margins against entrants whose cost structure was honed in the low-end, rugged, portable market.
And the product only serves to cannibalize their existing profitable sales, and they fail to capture any meaningful share of the newly created value network.
The failure is complete.
That disk drive history is so compelling because the cycles are so quick and clean. But what if the industry moves at a snail's pace? Does the framework still hold up? This is why the sources turning to the mechanical excavator industry, shovels, backhoes, is such a brilliant move. It removes the argument that failure is solely about the speed of Silicon Valley.
Right. The excavator industry operates at a much, much slower velocity, but the organizational physics are identical. Here, the disruptive cycles took 15 to 20 years to unfold, yet the same patterns of rational managerial failure destroyed the incumbents.
Okay, so let's first look at an example of successful, radical, sustaining change within this industry. The shift from steam power, which dominated from the 1830s, to gasoline power in the early 1920s. Now, that was a radical shift. New engines, new gearing, new operational logistics.
A huge change, yet 23 of the 25 largest steam shovel makers successfully navigated that transition. Because gasoline power was a sustaining innovation, it was objectively better along the key metric valued by their customers, general contractors, and miners, which was moving more earth, faster, more reliably, and at a lower cost per cubic yard.
So the established firms had the engineering talent, the customer relationships, and the financial incentive to lead the charge.
It fit perfectly into their value network.
So if they could handle that radical transition from steam to gasoline, where did they trip up? It was the shift from cable-actuated shovels to hydraulically actuated backhoes after World War II.
This was the disruptive killer. Early hydraulic backhoes, introduced by entrants like HOPTO and J.C. Bamford, were tiny. I mean, their bucket capacity was only 1/4 of a cubic yard. Their reach and lifting capacity were minimal compared to the big cable machines.
So a mainstream contractor, say a company digging a sewer line or running a large mining operation, who demanded 1 to 5 cubic yards of capacity.
They would look at that little hydraulic machine and rightly laugh. It was completely useless for their profitable work.
And rationally, the cable shovel incumbents ignored it. The hydraulic technology was initially worse on every single metric their mainstream customers valued. So the entrants were forced to find a new value network.
Yep.
Where did the quarter-yard backhoe find a home?
They found it with small residential contractors. These contractors used the small hydraulic backhoes as attachments for industrial tractors to dig narrow trenches from the street line to individual houses.
And critically, these were jobs that were previously done by hand.
With pickaxes and shovels. Because the enormous cable shovels were too expensive, too complex to mobilize, and just too imprecise for those small jobs.
This is a perfect definition of disruption. It's not just a cheaper product, it's a product that enables new consumption and targets non-consumers. It's performing a job that was impossible or impractical before.
Exactly. And once that new market was established, the relentless trajectory of improvement took over. While the mainstream market demanded only a slow, maybe 4% annual increase in bucket capacity, the entrants in the hydraulic space improved capacity at a much faster rate.
And eventually, they intersected.
Once hydraulic bucket capacity hit 2 cubic yards in the mid-1960s, it met the needs of the sewer and general excavation contractors, and the invasion was decisive.
So let's analyze the failure of Bucyrus Erie, the leading cable shovel maker. They didn't ignore hydraulics entirely, did they? They even bought a hydraulic company in 1950 and introduced their own hydraulic product, the Hydrohoe, in 1951.
They did, but the Hydrohoe was a hybrid part cable, part hydraulic. What Bucyrus was attempting to do was to mold the disruptive technology to fit its existing high-margin value network. Their sales force had relationships with massive general excavation contractors, and those guys needed capacity and reach.
And the hydraulic systems of the 1950s couldn't deliver that high capacity on their own, so they just bolted the hydraulics onto their high-reach cable lift mechanism.
This strategic decision shows the incumbents' organizational inertia in action. They weren't fighting the technology, they were fighting the need to create a new, low-margin organization to serve the tiny residential market.
And the hybrid failed.
It failed because it was still too limited for the big contractors, but it was too complex and expensive for the residential contractors who just wanted a simple tractor attachment.
It was a product optimized for a market that didn't exist.
Yeah.
It was stuck in the middle ground between the high-capacity mining operation and the small residential trench digger.
The outcome was brutal. Only 4 of the 30 major cable shovel manufacturers survived the transition to hydraulics. The others, like Bucyrus, they invested in the technology, but they failed to establish the dedicated, low-cost value network that was necessary to nurture it.
The pattern, regardless of whether the cycle is 2 years or 20 years, is structurally identical.
It is.
This brings us to the final case study detailed in the sources, which functions as a real-time stress test for the theory. It's the emergence of flash memory, or solid-state memory, into the disk drive market. And this allows us to apply the different strategic frameworks and see which ones correctly predict the outcome.
Right. Flash memory was a contemporary challenge for the disk drive makers at the time the book was published, and it represented a classic disruptive profile. On one hand, it was radically better on new metrics. It uses less than 5% of the power of a disk drive, and since it has no moving parts, it's far more rugged and shock-resistant.
But on the mainstream metrics of capacity and cost, it was initially terrible.
Horrendous, actually. Flash was anywhere from 5 to 50 times more expensive per megabyte than magnetic media. And it had a limited write cycle capacity. You could only overwrite the memory a few 100,000 times before it failed.
So it was rationally rejected by the mainstream notebook and desktop manufacturers.
Absolutely.
So let's run the numbers on the traditional predictive models. First up, the S-curve framework. This framework assumes that technology progresses along an S-curve, and it eventually plateaus.
Right. The S-curve model would have predicted no threat. Why? Because magnetic memory density was still improving at an increasing rate. The curve hadn't flattened at all. It was still accelerating upward. So, based on the S-curves, a rational manager would conclude that magnetic memory had decades of life left.
So the S-curve was the incorrect predictor for disruption.
Completely wrong. Next, you have the capabilities framework. This model asks a simple question. Does the incumbent organization possess the necessary technical skills to develop the new product?
And in this case,
In this case, yes. Seagate and Quantum had deep expertise in custom integrated circuit, or IC, design. That's essential for building controller chips and cache memory. The leap to designing competitive flash cards, often through partnerships, was entirely within their technical capabilities. So the capabilities framework predicted that the incumbents could adopt flash.
but Christensen's value network framework predicted failure. Why did it forecast failure despite the incumbent's high technical capability?
Because the value network framework ignores the can they do it question and instead asks, will the organization rationally choose to allocate resources to it? And the answer was no. Flash memory was first commercialized in markets far, far below the disk drive mainstream. Cellular phones, heart monitors, electronic cameras, electronic clipboards.
These were tiny markets that valued low power and ruggedness above all else. They had zero meaningful volume or margin potential for a multi-billion-dollar drive maker.
So the framework predicted failure because the disk drive mainstream market notebook computers demanded high capacity and low cost per megabyte. Flash simply could not deliver those metrics. Even if Seagate's engineers could make a flash card, their managers would rationally decide not to invest significant managerial energy or scarce capital in it because there was no path for that product to earn the high margins required by their existing business model.
The incumbent's organizational DNA just prevented them from nurturing an infant low-margin business.
And the outcome proved the value network framework accurate, at least within the source's timeline. Seagate and Quantum's internal flash card businesses had floundered by 1995. They both withdrew their products, stating publicly that the opportunity was not yet substantial enough.
And they reallocated those resources back to the high-end magnetic disk drive fight, the place where the established customers and the high margins were.
Right. And as they were retreating from those low-margin flash products and simultaneously moving up market with their magnetic drives, they were unwittingly pulling out of the 10 to 40 megabyte capacity range of the magnetic market.
Creating the classic vacuum.
Exactly. This allowed the flash manufacturers, who had been honing their low-cost structure in cell phones and cameras, to march relentlessly up the performance curve. Eventually, flash reached a competitive capacity point, becoming the ultimate successor to the hard disk drive in many applications. That decision to retreat was rational in the short term, but strategically fatal in the long run.
It seems so obvious in hindsight.
What this deep dive reveals is that the innovator's dilemma is not a series of unfortunate events. It is a structural, predictable pattern. It forces the best managers to make the worst long-term decisions. We can now distill the fundamental findings of the research into 5 laws of organizational nature that managers have to understand and harness.
And these aren't suggestions, are they? These are almost like physical laws governing market response. Let's start with the first one, resource dependence.
Law 1, resource dependence. Companies depend entirely on their current customers and investors for the resources they need to survive and grow. This makes them hyper-efficient at killing ideas their current, profitable customers explicitly don't want. The organizational filters are designed to screen out disruptive technologies because they are rejected by the current cash cow market.
Okay, second is the structural size problem, which is particularly acute for large, established firms.
Law 2. Small markets don't solve the growth needs of large companies. A multi-billion-dollar corporation seeking 20% growth needs something like $500 million to $1 billion in new sales annually. A new disruptive market, even if it has explosive future potential, starts way too small, maybe $50 million. The initial sales forecasts for disruptive tech are always insignificant, ensuring they never attract the top managerial talent, capital, or attention needed for success.
The third law addresses planning and prediction. We saw in the flash memory case that conventional market research just fails completely here.
Law 3. Unanalyzable markets. Markets that do not yet exist cannot be analyzed using traditional market research or detailed financial planning. Planning works brilliantly for sustaining innovation because the customers, the competitors, and the metrics are all known. But disruptive innovation requires a strategy of discovery, of iteration, of experimentation, which often leads to a strong first-mover advantage for entrants who are willing to learn and pivot quickly in the chaos of an emerging market.
The fourth concept is perhaps the most difficult to swallow. The idea that your greatest strength is also your crippling weakness.
Law 4. Capabilities define disabilities, the very processes, values, and culture that make an organization excellent in one value network, for instance, achieving high quality and efficiency and 50% margin products. Those become immediate disabilities when you're confronted with a disruptive threat that demands a different context, like optimizing for ruggedness and accepting 15% margins. The processes that ensure success in the mainstream actively ensure failure in the disruptive space.
And finally, the law that explains the physics of the market competition itself. Technology supply versus market demand.
Law 5. Technology supply versus market demand. Since performance improves faster than market needs, the basis of competition inevitably changes over time. Companies race up market, focusing on ever higher performance metrics, which allows a vacuum to form below them. The competition shifts, kinologically, from functionality first, then to reliability, then to convenience and customization, and finally to price. When incumbents focus only on functionality and reliability, they miss that inevitable shift toward convenience and price that the disruptors are riding.
So if the dilemma is structural and rational, then the solution must be organizational, not simply intellectual. It's not about working harder or hiring smarter managers. It's about aligning the size and structure of the organization to the size and the financial realities of the disruptive market.
Absolutely. The solution for the incumbent firm is to create autonomous organizations. Small, independent entities, often physically separated from the mothership, whose cost structures, management scale, and customer base match the needs of the emerging low-end market. This freedom protects the disruptive innovation from the gravitational pull of the existing high-margin value network, allowing it to incubate and grow until it is ready to invade the mainstream.
The true innovator's task, then, is therefore an internal one. It is ensuring that the product or idea that doesn't make sense today, the one that promises lower margins and requires a small team in an unknown market, is taken seriously and protected from the efficient but deadly resource allocation processes of the dominant company.
And that leaves you with the challenge. You now have the framework to spot the next failure. Look closely at your own industry or your competitors. Where are customers being overshot by performance? Where are they paying a high premium for functionality they don't use, creating an unseen vacuum for a simpler, cheaper, and more convenient disruption to emerge?
Because that is precisely where the next industry leader is being quietly born.
That's right.
That's a fundamental challenge to all existing business models.